Good afternoon or good evening, depending on from where you're tuning in. My name is Stephanie Seidel. I'm the curator at ICA Miami, and I would like to welcome Mara Hoberman as our speaker today. Of course, I would like to welcome all our guests and members of ICA, and we're really excited to have this talk about artist Michel Majerus on the occasion of the exhibition Michel Majerus Progressive Aesthetics that is currently on view at ICA Miami. It's the artist's first US museum survey, and we are showing works from 1991 to 2002 that stretch across a short but extremely prolific career of this artist. And we're excited to have Mara Hoberman here today, joining us from Paris, talking more about Majerus' work. Mara is also a contributor to the forthcoming monograph on the exhibition. First of all, I'd like to thank Mara for agreeing to be here with us today. And I'd also like to take the opportunity to thank all donors and lenders to this exhibition. Lead support is provided by the Nickel Family Fund, major support provided by Nogarim Schneider Berlin, support is provided by the Parrish Collection, and additional support is provided by Matthew Marks Gallery, Richard Chang, and Stephanie Andrew and Rebecca Reed, and in honor of Evan J. Reed. All exhibitions at ICA Miami and all digital initiatives, just like today's program, are supported by the Knight Foundation. And I would also like to thank Daniela Granadillo, Amanda Morgan, and Kat Fleitman for their help on this talk. Before we begin, I'm going to introduce Mara Hoberman, who is Paris-based curator, art writer, and editor. From 2007 to 2011, she was a curator at the Hunter College Art Galleries in New York, and until 2012, she was the project manager for the Catalogue Raisonné of the Drawings of Jasper Johns. She is currently conducting research in Paris for the Joan Mitchell Catalogue Raisonné. Mara regularly contributes to Art Forum and has also written for the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, eFlux Art Agenda, and many other outlets. Hoberman's essays and artist interview have been published in various catalogs produced by galleries and museums, including White Cube, Deutsche Projects, the Swiss Institute, as well as the Essel Museum, Mittelheim Museum, and the Louis Vuitton Foundation, as well as Palais de Tokyo and San Francisco Museum of Art. Hoberman is also the author of 10 ans d'art contemporain, which discusses trends and themes in contemporary art in France since 2011 via the work of artists who were supported by the Fondation des Artistes. Before we jump in and hear more in Michel Majerus from Mara, I would like to just give a very brief background on the artist. Michel Majerus was born in 1967 in Esch in Luxembourg, and he died in Luxembourg in 2002 at the age of 35. He has often been called a sampler of images, working akin to a DJ, pulling from cartoons, newspaper clippings, ads, logos, and other commercial visuals that he reproduces, recombines, and recontextualizes, along with appropriations and reinterpretations of other painters' historic work, which we'll see more about, in a variety of media, including oil, acrylic, digital print, adhesive vinyl, silkscreen, stencils, etc. Michel Majerus attended art school in Stuttgart, Germany, where he studied with the German abstract painter K.R.H. Sonderberg and later with the American conceptual artist Joseph Kosuth. After graduating, he lived and worked in Berlin, and during his brief career, Majerus also visited the United States a number of times, including a year-long residency at Art Center College of Design in Pasadena, Los Angeles in 2000 to 2001. There have been significant exhibitions of Majerus' work, such as the radical installation at Kunsthalle Basel he realized in 1996, a mural for the facade of the Italian pavilion for Harald Seemann's Dappertutto Venice Biennial in 1999, as well as a famed solo exhibition at the Kölnische Kunstverein in Cologne in 2000, where he realized a giant half-pipe. And there have been posthumous museum exhibitions at the Kunstmuseum Stuttgart, the CAPC Musée d'Art Contemporain de Bordeaux, as well as a traveling exhibition between the Kunsthaus Graz, Stedelijk Museum in Amsterdam, Deichtorhallen in Hamburg, Kästner Gesellschaft Hanover, and the Mudam in Luxembourg. We are also in the last year, in 2022, which marked the 20th year of the artist's passing. There was a series of exhibitions across Germany, including the KW in Berlin and the Kunstverein in Hamburg. And at the end of March, the exhibition Sinnmaschine will open at the Museum Luxembourg. At the end of the talk, you'll have the opportunity to pose questions. Please feel free to just drop them in the chat, and we're happy to discuss them. And without further ado, I'd like to welcome Mara again and hand over to her.
Hi, thank you, Stephanie. Thank you for that introduction, and thank you also for inviting me to share on Majerus. I will just say that he is not an artist that I was super familiar with, so I really appreciated the invitation to get to know his work, and through doing research for the essay that I wrote in this presentation, I've really come to appreciate him as an artist, and I'm looking forward to sharing this with you. Thanks, Stephanie, for also doing that great brief background on the artist, which allows me to dive right in. So here we go. So perhaps one of the first things that strikes us about Majerus's work is really the extent to which it is a reflection of his own here and now, which is, as Stephanie just said, Berlin, and to a lesser extent, New York and Los Angeles during the period between the 1990s and the early 2000s. His works are really filled with references to popular culture and also subcultures from this period. And what I'm going to focus on today in this talk is how Majerus applied the language of branding, which is coming from the commercial world, to the world of contemporary art and art history. And I'll argue that in doing this, Majerus creates his own artistic brand. So to just begin, here's a selection of works from 1994 to 2002, so a good spread from over the course of his short career, where we see references to products that were popular during this time: candy bars, ice cream packages. We have Super Mario, Toy Story, and up in the left corner, this Super Soaker water gun. And while I'm sure all these logos and characters are easily recognizable, maybe even nostalgia-inducing to those of us who were coming up during this period, Majerus's oeuvre is really more than a time capsule of just these kind of faddish products and dated graphic design. Because in addition to referencing consumer culture, Majerus also appropriated freely from contemporary artists and art history. And this, for me, is where things get really interesting. So just looking at the upper right, for me, the pop in that 2001 painting Popsicle surely has a double entendre. So referring not only to the cold sugary sweet, but also to pop art. Because it seems to me that Majerus considered and appropriated other artists' signature styles, much in the same way that he did product brands and logos. So for him, there's really no hierarchy in the imagery he uses. The supermarket shelves and the museum walls are really all fair game when it comes to his subject matter. So to dive in, let's look a little more closely at one of these works. Here's the Super Soaker 200 from 1994. And in this painting, which is on the right, we see him combining a popular toy, this water gun, and this particular one is from 1991, with a reference to the artist Willem de Kooning. And if you'll notice in the lower half of Majerus's painting, which is again on the right, it's inspired by a de Kooning drawing. I'm not exactly sure which one, but as you can see from the images on the bottom, which is a de Kooning book from 1966 of drawings, Majerus is really mimicking the older artist's recognizably kind of sketchy but assertive black lines. And he even goes as far as to copy de Kooning's signature, which you can see in that lower part of his work. And I wanted to show the cover of this de Kooning publication of drawings from 1966, because de Kooning himself, well, first of all, you can see that Majerus did a pretty good job of replicating the signature, but also the fact, more than that, that de Kooning used his own signature as the cover for his book is really important. And I think Majerus would have appreciated that the signature stands alone as the cover without any artwork means that the name of the artist, his own hand, is really more important, more iconic than even any of the artworks themselves inside the book. So yeah, this is a bit of an unexpected mashup of a 1990s toy and a famous 20th century artist, but it also really unites these two seemingly unrelated subjects as being part of the same visual language of branding. As part of my research on Majerus, I visited the artist's estate in Berlin, which was fantastic. And here we see a bookshelf in the estate that holds the artist's personal library. So I wanted to note that Majerus had a lot of books on painting. Notably, he had monographs on Clemente, Gauguin, Gilbert and George, Gorky, Lautrec, Richard Prince, Schnabel, and Frank Stella. And he also had about 20 catalogs on Warhol. And Warhol was a very important reference for Majerus, and I became really interested in how Majerus appropriated Warhol's art, much in the same way that Warhol himself appropriated from pop culture. And so in this way, when I started thinking about it, I thought that Majerus created a kind of mise en abîme of pop art. And what I mean by that is that Majerus uses other artists' artworks in the same way that the pop artist used products. So he identified the power and the association of brand logos, and he reproduced them. So on the right of these bookshelves, we see these binders with the white spines, and those are full of archival materials, which I was really excited to see and which are really interesting. So inside those are clippings, tear sheets, products, wrappers, also excerpts from magazines and catalogs that Majerus took as inspiration. And the estate was kind enough to provide these images from inside the binders, and these give a really close look at the kinds of materials that the artist was looking at, collecting, saving, and then using in his own paintings. And you'll see here, it just gives a great sense of the variety of stuff that he was fascinated by and pulling from. So there's like everything from the M&M to the dishwashing or laundry detergent packaging, all kinds of things. And you can kind of get a sense of what was interesting to him in terms of color, in terms of font, in terms of the kinds of products. And I should just say that we're not sure how these kind of materials were organized and saved by Majerus. So the fact that these are together on one page doesn't mean that he put them together that way, although we will see some collages that he made later on. Here's another one that's just great. I mean, you'll see some of the elements if you've seen the show or looked at a lot of his work. Things like that splash of milk are things that were really interesting to him and which appear in his works. I feel like that swirl of peanuts on the upper right would have just fascinated him. And then down on the bottom, whatever this mini filter is, to me, that font, that bubble font, is something that we see again and again in his work, something that he really liked. And then down on the bottom right is this phone card, like an old-fashioned card that you would use to make a phone call in a public telephone, especially in Europe. And I think he might have just loved the idea that even that was branded, so that basically everything we are interacting with has some kind of logo, some kind of branding. And then in these same binders that we found all those packaging and wrappers, he also had clippings from exhibition catalogs. And so here, for example, on the right side is a page with installation shots from the famous Westkunst show that was held in Cologne in 1981. And this show notably featured works by some of Majerus's favorite artists, including de Kooning, Schnabel, Stella, and Warhol. And as I was flipping through these binders, it became very clear to me that the eclectic references to pop culture and art history that we find in Majerus's works were, for him, really part of the same visual language. So, like, Stella's stripes are as iconic as a nice Nike swoosh, and a candy bar wrapper carries just as much weight as like a Warhol skull, for example. And the binders, they also really helped me understand how important it is that Majerus initially encountered much of the artwork that interested him as reproductions in books or magazines. He wasn't necessarily seeing these things in galleries or museums, but he was seeing them already as photographs, which means that everything was flat, everything is an image, everything is equal, and there's, as a result, no hierarchy of these images when they get translated into his paintings. I think this, of course, feels very familiar to us today because we're so used to seeing things on screens, everything from artwork to shopping to the newspaper. But this was all just sort of really starting at the time that Majerus was working. And this clipping, we'll come back to it, but I wanted to show it because it's an important reference for Majerus. The image on top is an installation shot from an exhibition in 1985 at Shafrazi Gallery in New York, where Warhol and Basquiat showed paintings that they worked on together. And especially the painting that we see kind of on that back wall far away, I know it's really hard to make it out here, was a huge reference for Majerus, and he actually copied it in an important body of work that we'll look at in a bit, which is on view at ICA, and we will come back to that. But I was happy to see this in his archive. And then here's just another little sampling. This time I put this together, so each of these images is actually a separate page in one of the binders, and it just gives an idea of how really diverse and interleaved the references are that he's looking at. So like we have in the bottom center there, that's an image of a work by Frank Stella, right next to the sneaker ad, next to the Pac-Man. And up in the upper right corner is a Rosenquist, chocolate bars, like really everything is fair game to him, and it's all interesting, it's all material for him, and it's all treated with equal weight. And as I was looking through these binders, it was exciting because I found references for specific finished paintings, which I thought would be fun to share as one or two examples. So here on the left is a magazine clipping with some kind of product review for that Nike shoe, I guess, where they're showing kind of the sole of the shoe. And next to that is what appeared in the binders. I didn't quite know what it was, but thanks to Google search, I put it in there and it popped up that it was the inside liner notes for a CD compilation. So it's a Swiss synth pop group called Yellow, and that was an album that came out in 1995. And I guess Majerus had that album and he cut out the liner notes and he Xeroxed it or scanned it and kind of blew it up and kept it on file. And then you can see below in this work, which is titled, "Yet Sometimes What is Read Successfully Stops Us with Its Meaning, #1, from 1998, you can see how he combined these elements. So it's not the exact same sneaker, but he probably had that sneaker somewhere. And then he cut out that swirly psychedelic pattern and made it the background. And here is that painting. It's a very large silk screen and digital print painting on adhesive foil on aluminum, and it's on view at ICA Miami. And here also from the binders on the left is a small collage that served, it looks like, as the basis for a painting titled Overdose, which is quite a massive painting from 1997. And from the look of this, it seems that the artist made a Xerox of these original packagings, including one for this Overdose ice cream bar that gives the title of the final work, putting it together with some laundry soap and some, junk food drinks. And then in the final painting, he enlarged everything and added, I guess, Woody from Toy Story, who looks kind of overwhelmed maybe by all this overdose of products. But it was interesting to me too, when I was looking at the painting, those gray areas in the back, I probably wouldn't have thought much about them had I not seen this reference material, which to me looks like it was made on the bed of a scanner or a Xerox machine. And that gray is really just the blank space left over from when he reduced this collage down on the scanner or the Xerox. And then the fact that he goes and reproduces this in the painting it gray like that, is fascinating because he's referencing the technical process that he used to sort of flatten his image source, and then is translating that into a compositional element in the final painting. And here we see, here's Overdose on the left. So it's really quite large, quite massive work. And that's how it's installed at ICA Miami. And just one more collage, which was in the binder. And again, it looks to me like this was made on a scanner or a Xerox machine. And on this point, I just wanted to quickly note that in the mid-1990s, Majerus began carrying around a small video camera. It was a Sony Handycam, and he used this to record various visual inspirations that he came upon in his daily life. So things he saw on the street, concert posters, graffiti, billboards, things like that. And then he would take stills from these videos, little snippets, and he would use them as references when he meant to make paintings. And so in addition to the scanner and the Xerox, video was another way that he began to flatten imagery. So even things he was seeing, in reality, he needed to kind of add or remove in order to work them into his paintings. So I found that really neat. Okay, so now I wanted to talk more specifically about the way that Majerus incorporates other artists' styles and techniques into his own works. So here we see two paintings from 2002. On the left is Depression, and on the right is Plastic. And in both of these, Majerus uses a squeegee to smear paint across the canvas. So Majerus would have been interested in the squeegee's technique, I think, in its formal and textural possibilities, but I'm sure he was also very much aware of its close association with another painter, Gerhard Richter. And of course, Richter began using the squeegee as part of his painting practice in 1980. And Majerus even acknowledged that the resulting blur that he gets when he uses the squeegee is really a Richter trademark, because when he describes this process of using the squeegee, Majerus calls it Richtering. So there's Richtering in both of these works. And here's a still from a documentary on Richter where we see him using the squeegee, pulling and pushing the paint across the canvas to get that kind of signature blurred effect that he's certainly known for. And here again is Plastic as it's installed at the ICA Miami. And the parts here that are quote unquote Richtered are the yellow, green, orange kind of bands that are on top of the blue and white. And it's even maybe easier to see in Depression, which is here installed at ICA Miami, where the Richtering really, it almost nearly erases Majerus's name, which is across the top. And it really blurs it out. And this was also interesting to me because it might seem like it's like a self-deprecating gesture to erase his own name like that. And certainly the title Depression would support that as well. But to me, this is actually a great example of how Majerus pays homage to a famous living painter, Richter, while also managing to effectively reduce that painter to kind of a single type of mark making. And it's this blend of reverence and satire, which is very typical of Majerus. And it's almost what we might start to consider his own brand or signature style. So Majerus, it's also interesting to note that he, being of a younger generation, sort of updated Richter's mechanized painting technique for the digital age. And in 2001, he did a series of smudge tool paintings. That was the title of the series, which are certainly reminiscent of Richter's smears and blurs. But as the series title tells us, these works are actually based on marks made with a Photoshop tool, the smudge tool. And I like this because at the end of the day, it's really true that Majerus remains attached and rooted in painting. So in the smudge tool paintings and other works, he endorses digital techniques. He's definitely of a digital age, but he translates it back into painting, and that's really important. In a way, the digital tools that he uses ultimately affirm his allegiance to an analog medium. And this is also related to the fact that he's in constant dialogue with other painters who are his contemporaries and who are also from art history. So like Richter's squeegee, the artist Christopher Wool's stencil lettering appealed to Majerus as a form of semi-mechanized painting, which then developed into Wool's signature style. So here on the left is a work by Christopher Wool, Apocalypse Now, from 1988. And on the right is a work by Majerus from 1992. And Wool's iconic black and white word paintings, which he began in the 1980s, inspired Majerus to stack the words cool on top of wool in these black stenciled letters on a white background. So definitely mimicking wool. And he not only appropriates the style, but also the artist's last name. So it's a visual, but it's also a lexical acknowledgement of Wool's recognizability at this point. And like with the Richter, I think there's just like a hint of friendly mockery there. And this here is a view of an exhibition that was organized by the Michel Majerus estate in Berlin in 2020. And it brought together works by Wool, which you see at the center there at the back, and Majerus on the left. Frank Stella is another artist that inspired Majerus and whose works he imitated on many occasions. So in a 2002 email, Majerus wrote to his friend and fellow artist, Heike Karen Fohl, and this is a quote, yesterday, today, and tomorrow, I am being Frank Stella as I am painting my triangles. They are going to be quite garish neon colors because I have not done any color tests at all. And the resulting works, which is the pressure group paintings from that same year, from 2002, can be seen here on the right as in an installation shop at the Mudam Museum in Luxembourg. And you'll see they feature these diagonal stripes of uniform thickness, which evoke Stella, certainly, but they're not a direct quote. But like with Richter and with Wool, Stella provided Majerus with a style that is easy to replicate and riff on, but is also deeply, even inextricably linked to another specific artist's identity, or we might start to say brand. And here in the back is the pressure groups 1 on view at the ICA Miami. And in an earlier work, Majerus made an even more direct reference to Frank Stella. So this painting that you see on the left here, the large one, is from 1994. It's called Weißes Bild, and it features a flat but otherwise pretty faithful rendering of an actual three-dimensional painting on aluminum by Frank Stella, whose title is Bene come il sale from 1987. And unfortunately, we weren't able to show an image of that particular Stella painting, but the work on the upper right is very similar and from the same period. And as you can see on the left, Majerus's reference to Stella is partially obscured, pretty obscured, by these thick strokes of white paint that have been layered, on top of the entire image. And when I was thinking about this white paint, it could be that Majerus is mocking Stella, his famous defense of minimalism, when he said, what you see is what you see, except if you can't see it. But more likely, I think that this whiting out is a reference to yet another of Majerus's favorite artist subjects. Weißes Bild, whose title translates in English to white image, is likely a nod to Robert Ryman and his signature strokes, which are, of course, these white brushstrokes that he did again and again. And the year after he made Weisses Bild, Majerus wrote in his journal, quote, "A good painting often becomes more important and better when it is next to another good painting, to which it is entirely unrelated." So this struck me because it occurred to me that Weisses Bild really visualizes exactly what Majerus is writing in that quote in his journal. It visualizes this theory, but also takes it one step further because it literally fuses together two paintings and also two painters' signature styles on one canvas. So Stella and Ryman, we could say that was an imagined collaboration, but Majerus did latch on to an actual very high profile collaboration. It was between two of the best known artists of the 20th century, Jean-Michel Basquiat and Andy Warhol. And here again is that clipping that we saw in the archives. And again, it's from the top image in that clipping is from Tony Shafrazi's gallery show in 1985, where Warhol and Basquiat showed images that they made jointly. And the work, again, on the back wall that we can barely see, I'm sorry for that, became the inspiration for a dozen paintings and silk screens that Majerus made in 1999. And here's one of them. So in 1999, Majerus reproduced this Basquiat Warhol work, like I said, at least a dozen times. Here we see just one version, and in it we recognize immediately, I think, the iconic imagery of both artists, notably the logos of General Electric and Arm & Hammer by Warhol, and then the black skeletal figure with a crown by Basquiat. And Majerus copied this work in its entirety, making a silkscreen of the composition and then printing it over and over onto identical, nearly square canvases. And then as a final gesture, Majerus inserted himself into this kind of infamous creative partnership by adding just one single stroke of paint or lacquer. And that's what you see on the right here in blue. And each one has a slightly different color or colors on that right side. And here's an installation shot from Miami where you see the variation in that one stroke that Majerus adds. And to me, it comes as no surprise that he would be interested in this particular high-profile collaboration because it was really also a publicity stunt. There was a poster advertising this Basquiat Warhol show at the Shafrazi Gallery, and it showed the two artists wearing boxing gloves. And I feel like Majerus would have really liked that there was this sense of kind of friendly competition between artists, and also enjoyed the fact that this show was really marketed heavily and not really in the way that gallery shows tend to be. It was much more closer to the advertising world. And yes, so as I said before, Warhol is a key reference for Majerus, and I think he loved the fact that Warhol made logos for supermarket staples like Brillo pads, like Campbell's soup cans, even more famous than any marketing campaign could have ever hoped. And he would have enjoyed Basquiat as well, because Basquiat also kind of harnessed the power of logos with his Samo graffiti tag and the three-pointed crown, which is almost like a signature for him as well. And also the fact that Basquiat really, in the 1980s, represented a return to painterly painting, which I think Majerus was a fan of. So one takeaway that I've had from looking at a lot of Majerus's work now is that once I started thinking about references to other artists in his work, it really almost became like a game of like who's who and what's what and who is he looking at and who is he copying. Appropriation is so essential to his work, like in the spirit of Sturtevant or Louise Lawler and Richard Prince, that even unintentional references start to become very relevant. So in 2001, while Majerus was living in Los Angeles as part of a residency program, he sent an email to Heike Karen Fohl again, in which he described a chance visit to LA Louvre Gallery, where he saw, and this is the quote, a Hockney, one of the lovely early works dating from 69, a naked figure. So we know that the painting that he saw was not a swimming pool painting. It was not Splash or a bigger Splash. But it is interesting to consider the fact that Majerus made several of his own splash paintings in 2001 and 2002. Now, the title of these paintings ostensibly comes from a 1990s water toy, a little ball that you throw in the pool or the lake, called a splash bomb, and whose logo Majerus reproduced in various ways in several paintings. But to me, it also seems quite possible that he was thinking about Hockney. And here in this painting, which is one of the more sober works from the splash paintings, the word splash is written in that splash bomb font, and it kind of floats against this watery blue-gray background. And the band of lighter blue at the right might even suggest like the edge of a pool or a diving board or something like that. So here we see a splashier splash painting and also an example of the toy itself. And you can see really just how faithfully he copied that Splash Bomb's logo with the swirls and the colors and the, that whole 90s feeling about it. And whether or not Majerus's splash paintings are intentional references to Hockney, I don't know, but I almost feel that it's kind of irrelevant because Majerus has so effectively integrated the language of fine art and product logos into what is his own brand of painting that we can't help but automatically associate the references when we're looking at his work. And here is another splash painting titled Splash Bombs 2, which is on view at the ICA Miami. Okay, so now I want to turn and look at how Majerus branded himself. And in what I would consider the culmination of Majerus fusing the visual references to consumer culture and art history to create his own artistic signature, what he did is he created a logo using his own name. In the year 2000, Majerus set his first and last names in colorful bubble letter font, and he animated the letters so that the text sort of fractures and comes back together in this endless loop of disintegration and reconstitution. And here are two images of it installed. And so this was originally presented as a single channel video installation across 25 TV screens, like you saw in the previous slide. And then when I saw this, it reminded me of two things. It reminded me of the MTV logo that kind of served as a house ad between paid advertising on the MTV channel. Let's see if this works. And it also reminded me of, again, Warhol, just this idea of showing images across a grid like that that are changing, not changing, slightly different. And I definitely thought of Warhol's portraits and his self-portraits when I saw this work in which Majerus is, using his own name as a brand, as a logo, as a self-portrait. And then shortly after he did the video, Majerus took the logo back into painting, and he made a series of works on canvas, MM1, MM2, and MM3, all in 2001. And each was based on a still from the original animation. And to me, when I saw these paintings, they immediately brought to mind some very early works by Robert Ryman, who in the late 50s enlarged his own signature so that it really functioned as a compositional element in the paintings themselves. And again, I'm really sorry that we can't show an image of one of those Ryman paintings, but there are some on MoMA's website for anyone who's interested. to take a look. And here we see MM1 on the left, and on the right is how it looks currently installed at the ICA Miami. So the MM paintings are contemporaneous with the debut of a similar series of work by the artist Josh Smith, who started his name paintings. That's the title of the series in 2001. So both artists in 2001 started to treat their own names as a subject. And Smith has continued this practice ever since. So it's been long after Majerus died, and Smith's name paintings are now, I would say, one of his most iconic bodies of work. So that's just interesting to note that they started at the same time, and Smith keeps going with it. So I don't really think it's worth speculating where Majerus would have taken his mise en abîme of pop had he lived longer, but it is interesting to think about painters who are working today and who are investigating ideas that Majerus raised concerning the intersection of art and branding. And for me, Majerus's legacy lives on in the works of artists like Joshua Abloh, Lady Churchman, Jeff Elrod, Ali Epp, Alex Israel, and Christian Markley, who, among many others, continue to draw connections between pop culture and art history as they are each creating and defining their own brand. So here, for example, we have two works by Lady Churchman, who was born in 1979. And like Majerus, Churchman is copying iconic logos, as you see on the left, and also famous artworks. And the work on the right is a copy of Rousseau's The Repast of the Lion, which is circa 1907. And interestingly to note, it's painted not from the original, but from reproductions that the artist found on the internet. So I find this idea of painting from something that is found on screen is really similar to Majerus flattening the references on a scanner or a Xerox or the camcorder, and taking artworks and other elements out of their original context and treating them just as images. Here we have on the left a self-portrait by Alex Israel, who was born in 1982. And Israel makes a lot of paintings in this particular form, which is based on his own profile. So here we have his silhouette, which is, it has his recognizable hair, his glasses, and it really functions like a logo of the artist himself. And in this one, I think it's great. He's conflating his own profile with the cover of Marcel Duchamp's biography, which features that artist's profile facing the other way. So really kind of conflating himself with Duchamp. And on the right is a painting by Ali Epp, who was born in 1994, in which he borrows a recognizable motif, this time from Mondrian, and uses it as the dress for this kind of contemporary odalisque a la Ingres or Manet. And like Majerus, Epp is referencing art history, but he also is very much describing his own here and now. In other works, not this one, he includes lots of contemporary logos. He has Nike, he has McDonald's, and he also often references the luminosity of screens again, which is how, of course, we look at art and a lot of other things these days. And then here on the left, we have a work by Jeff Elrod, born in 1966, so really a contemporary of Majerus. And this one is a wall painting that he's been recreating since 1997. And Elrod described this work as what Matisse would have done had he had a computer instead of scissors. So there's a reference to Matisse and also to contemporary technology that has become Elrod's own visual language. And I find this similar to Majerus using the computer and the technology of his day to kind of recast or reinvent art history. And on the right here, we have a work by Joshua Abloh, born 1976, where he conflates himself and the artist Barnett Newman simply by painting a zip and titling this work Barnett Abloh. So Majerus certainly never, I don't think, was so bold in his titling, but I find it very Majerus-esque, this idea to kind of invent a collab between oneself and a canonical artist. And finally, just a final example of a work that reminds me of Majerus is this recent series by Christian Marclay, who was born in 1955. And this is a painting, he's done many of them, that is about action painting. So of course, there's a direct reference to Jackson Pollock's signature splatter, which Marclay reimagines in this kind of onomata poetic language of comic books, which is the pop culture reference. So he's bringing the two worlds together like Majerus did. Here he's painting the sounds that paint makes when it hits the canvas. And he's really making a painting that insists on the materiality of painting, even as it's also referencing flatness. So comics, or even immaterial aspects like sound. And on that note, with this little look at how other artists have been picking up on what Majerus started in terms of ideas and themes, I will wrap it up for my presentation and again say thank you so much for having me, Stephanie, and everyone at ICA. And I look forward to any questions that anyone might have.
Thank you so much, Mara. This was really fascinating. And yeah, as you said, if our audience has any questions, feel free to drop them in the chat. Just out of curiosity, there are so many interesting parts, and I actually realized you showed this like milk carton from the archive. Yeah. Kind of almost feels like it is part of the plastic painting.
Totally. Yeah.
But yeah, I was wondering if you could tell us more about the archive and how that maybe also shifted of your perception of the work. And I mean, some people might know there is an archive in the former studio of Michel in Berlin, Prenzlauer Berg, that also functions as an exhibition space. And you showed the view of the exhibition with Christopher Wool. They regularly stage shows around Michel's work and have this, this huge treasures there that you were able to unearth.
Yeah. I have to agree. It was really revelatory to me to see these binders of the original source material. And I think, as I said in the talk, it really like confirmed for me just kind of how democratic he was about all the image sources that he's using. Like he doesn't really differentiate between something that came off the side of a cereal box and something that might be hanging on the wall of MoMA or wherever. Like he sees something in that image that is interesting to him that he wants to mimic or copy or appropriate, or however we want to call it. And he kind of does that very freely, which I think once you see these materials, it changes maybe how you look at the paintings, because it seems a little less heavy to me. Like it all seemed just kind of like, he just was quirky and he liked these images, and he wanted to paint them, and he wanted to paint them sometimes huge, you know?
Yeah, and I think it's also, I mean, I've read a number somewhere that said he made approximately 1,500 paintings across the time of 11 years. And I think it's what you say, that the individual work is not necessarily super precious, but to him it was important to just have this kind of pace and quantity that allowed him to be, I think that's might be part of what allowed him to be so light and kind of free and just painting all these very different works.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like he was just taking it all in from every aspect of his life, like the idea of walking around with a camcorder to record things that he was actually encountering in real life, and then kind of using that stuff in the same way that he did reproductions of things that he found in magazines. I'm sorry, reproductions of artworks that he saw in magazines or in catalogs, like just that flexibility that he wanted to kind of use it all, like anything he saw was getting in there.
Yeah. And so we actually have a question about plastic that we were just talking about from Scott Coleman, who generously lent to the exhibition, the painting plastic. And the question is what plastic may refer to in this painting?
Oh, the title. That is a great question. I would only have guesses about that. I mean, your idea, Stephanie, that it, that some kind of splash of something liquid is really good. I don't know. I like knowing that he used the squeegee. The squeegee has some plastic on the, on the edge. That's what makes that kind of super smooth smear. The way that the font is also makes me think that he took it specifically from a reference, and then titled it after that. So I guess my best guess would be that it is some product written in that font that he's using. But this one is pretty abstract, so we can't really see what the subject is, except that it's that it's a kind of recognizable, distinct font that maybe he was attracted to. That's my best guess.
Yeah, I agree. And maybe it's also kind of a play on plastic being this kind of artificial material that while he still paints it on canvas, I don't know, maybe it's also, I feel with Majerus, I feel his work is very sincere, but also there's always a little bit of cheekiness in it.
For sure. I mean, I think that definitely with the way that he references the other artists, there's always like a little jab in there. Like certainly he is enamored of these great painters, but he's also like kind of taking them down a notch, being like, I can do that too. And here it is.
Yeah. And there's another question actually to this reference of art history in his works, saying from Kevin Yao, Majerus clearly had his eye on art history and firmly establishing himself within the canon of art history. How do you think his lifting works from artists, ads, etc., accomplished this?
Well, yeah, I think that in the end is what I kind of became most interested in. The way that he defined himself to me was by just sort of being able to appropriate in a way from art history that was the same that the pop artists were appropriating from consumer products. So I feel like he flattened everything, and he made his own style out of the fact that he could do that he did do that, and that he didn't really distinguish between whether he wanted to take, a brushstroke from de Kooning and put that in his painting, or if he wanted to take like a Coke bottle cap and put that in his painting. He could execute them both very, very well. And then also sort of disturb people, or at least provoke people, by having all of those elements come together in his paintings. So it's not just pop, and it's not just appropriation of other artworks, of other artists' artworks. It's really both all together at the same time.
And I think you mentioned in the beginning of your talk the mise en abîme of pop art, which I found really interesting because it also kind of plays with the frame, because I think so much of his work is also about the framework of the scale. He chooses to reproduce something which ranges from, as we saw in one of the first slides, from like a small square canvas to this massive billboard format that we have with plastic.
Mhm.
And he is like very savvily constantly manipulating the framework of these images.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's why it's so important to see these works in person. I mean, what I knew of Majerus was definitely mostly through reproductions, which now that I say it, maybe he would have liked that because that's how he looked at a lot of art himself. But it does change everything to see the scale, to see the kind of three-dimensionality of a lot of them, like this one. It was a real pleasure for me when I went to the estate in Berlin to see all the work that was up at that time for, for the anniversary of his death, because there is such a range. I mean, there's a range of materials, there's a range of scale, and it really has a big impact. And yeah, at the show, I mean, even just showing these installation shots from Miami, you can see that. I mean, it's quite diverse.
And there's another question. How should we react to Majerus reductivism? Is it a good thing that Richter is reduced to a squeegee?
Is it a good thing? I think it's his thing. Like that's a little bit what he's trying to point out. Like, why does someone get super famous for one specific trait and then we associate them with that and they are called a genius, but it's actually, I mean, it's a squeegee. Like, and he shows that he can do it just as well. So at the same time that he's giving, like all the credit to Richter for doing this and for making, all of these paintings that are, so well known and so well collected and presented everywhere. He's giving credit, but he's also sort of, I wouldn't say mocking, but he's just kind of asking, why is that? What does that mean? Why have we ascribed all of this importance to, this technique because it's by one person? And maybe it goes back to the genius of the artist, which I don't know how Majerus would have felt about that. I think maybe he would have had really interesting kind of off-color things to say.
Yeah, and I vaguely remember, I wish I could quote it correctly right now, but there is a short line in his notes that she also referenced, and I can highly recommend this book, which is definitely his notebooks from '95. I recommend this, and also, of course, the forthcoming monograph that Mara contributed to from ICA. But in this notes, he actually talks about, I think, how he doesn't want to have people recognize a strategy or a system in his moves, but he wants to stay unpredictable. And as soon as he felt like people would understand what he was doing, he would try to do something else or something along these lines.
Yeah, and there are so many more examples of artists that he cites from that could have gone into this presentation. I mean, he was really, there are quotes in those journals from today, I'm doing this person today, like he went through all the styles and all of the greats. And then there's that painting that was on view in Berlin, where he says, F word, all of those painters across the whole canvas.
Yeah, and actually, as we're looking at this work, yet sometimes what is read successfully stops us in its meaning. Number one, there's another question relating to the question of success. So in your research, did you figure out what or why Michel would qualify a specific painting of his as successful?
I don't know. I did think a lot about this title of this particular work, which was, when it was initially shown, it was shown as part of Manifesta, which was in Luxembourg, and it was actually on view inside of a multiplex movie theater, and they put it kind of on the wall right next to the concession stand. So it was like by the popcorn machine, and there was a Coke poster next to it. And it felt in some ways like so at home in that kind of commercial context, like it was in a mall or a food court. And the logo of the Nike is like dialoguing with the Coke poster. And then I was looking at the title, and I don't know, my best guess again is that sometimes that if you're reading this successfully, his artwork, it stops you. Like it's too easy to look at it as just that comfortably sitting next to the actual advertisements. Like it is saying something, and it's up to the viewer to notice that, but it's also his intention to kind of make you stop and say, what is the difference? What is the difference here of doing this artwork where, he's showing it's got a Nike logo right there on it. Why is that different than an actual advertisement? So I don't know that answers that question at all, but just in terms of what he wants the painting to successfully do, I think it's that. I think it's to get people to stop and make some kind of distinction between what he's doing and between what's sort of already out there.
Yeah, I think that's maybe a great way to close. And I would like to thank you again. It was wonderful to just get such a special insight into his way of working and the whole universe that you opened up for us, that he references.
Thank you for having me and for the assignment. It was a pleasure.
Well, and thank you everyone for tuning in. The exhibition is still on view till March 19th. And as I mentioned, there's a forthcoming monograph with contributions by Mara and other writers. And there's more information on our website at icamiami.org. Thank you again, everyone.